Welcome to my course, Game Development Basics, Week 7, Lesson 2, Creating a Repository. In this lesson, we'll describe the process of creating a repository, and then we'll describe the process of sharing your project repository to others. Let's start by creating a new repository. Here I am in the GitHub desktop, and creating a new repository is pretty simple. For this lesson, I'm going to create a new repository for the game we made in week 1, Ball Maze. And this process is fairly straightforward. Now, there's another way that I'm going to show you in lesson 4 of this week, but for this lesson, I wanted to keep it pretty simple. So to create a new repository, over here on Current Repository, you'll click this drop down, and then you'll select Add. And there's 3 options. Clone repository is when you want to make a local version of another existing repository. Create new repository is what we're going to use. And add existing repository is if you have a repository that already exists on your PC somewhere and you want to add it to the GitHub client. So let's select Create New Repository. The first thing it's going to ask you to do is name your repository. I'm going to call this Ball Maze Game. And then here in the path is where on your machine do you want the repository to be. I have a folder on an external drive where I save all of my projects. So I'm not going to change this. There's a checkbox to initialize the repository with a README file. And this is commonly where you can put instructions for users on how to initialize your game or any other information you think they may need to know. So if you're going to be sharing your project with a team, I recommend creating this and then just putting a few notes in here for the team. The next field is git ignore. Now, when we're creating a repository, there may be files that we don't want to send back and forth because they're not necessary for everyone to have. For instance, when we're working on Unreal Engine, there are 2 folders, intermediate and saved, that don't need to be sent between users because these are created locally on your machine. We could say don't send anything that's in these files because each person will have their own version of these. Similarly, when we start to use C++, there's another folder that's going to be called binaries. And we don't want to send that either because that also contains local data that doesn't need to be shared with other users. Each user will create their own version of those. And there's quite a few other ones as well, but there's a shortcut here. We can just select this drop down and type Unreal. And there's a pre-existing git ignore file built in that we can select. And this will automatically ignore all the files. Now you may want to add to this, but this at least will get you started with creating this git ignore file. And the last one is license. Now, if you're going to be sharing your project with people, I recommend doing some research on which one of these might be the best for you, depending on what license you want. I usually just select MIT license because I think this one is applicable in most cases, but this may not be the right one for you, so I definitely recommend doing some research. The last thing, we'll just select Create Repository. And now we have our repository on our local machine, but we need to send it to the remote so that other people can have access to it, and also so that if there is an issue with the project files and we need to recover them, we have a version of this project that exists somewhere other than our PC. So we can either select here where it says Publish Repository or this blue button. And in most cases, whenever you see this page in GitHub Desktop, it's giving you kind of some hints on some things that you may want to do with your project. So if you ever get lost and you're not sure what to do next, you could always look here and maybe the answer is right in front of you. So I'm going to select Publish Repository, and it brings us up to another screen. And this is asking us, how do we want to publish this for other users? So again, we want to have the name, which shouldn't change, a description if you would like, and then you have the option to make this a public or private repository. If it's public, that means anyone that finds your repository could go in there and make changes to your project. Now, in some cases, like if you're trying to create a resume piece or you want to share something with the world that you've made as a tool, you may want to have a public repository. If you're going to do that, I do recommend doing some research on this. You want to create some additional restrictions that can be done through GitHub or GitLab or whatever remote you're using. In most cases though, I think you're gonna want to keep it private, especially when you're early working on your game, and you can always change this later. So if you want to make it private after it's been public or vice versa, you can always change this through GitHub. But I'm going to keep this one private. And then organization, if you belong to any organizations, you can publish this to a certain organization. So if you work for a game dev company and they have their own organization on GitHub, or if you want all of your repositories cataloged based upon your own game development company, you can create your own organization, and then anyone that's part of that organization would have access to all the repositories. I'm going to keep this as none for now though. And the last step is to publish repository. And here I am back on github.com in my repositories, and I've searched for ball so that I could find that one. And now I could see that this repository now has a remote that other people could have access to. So now we'll discuss how to share your project repository with others. Now, because we set this up as a private repository, other people won't be able to find this unless we add them as a collaborator. So what we need to do is go to Settings and then select Collaborators, and it's going to prompt you to put your password in. And then here you can select Add People, and you can find someone by their GitHub username, their full name, or their email address. And just to show you, I've searched for one of my other favorite content creators, Stephen Ulibarri, and if I wanted to, I could select his profile and add him to this repository. But in most cases, this is going to be the other people on your team. Now, here on GitHub, we could see the repository, and what we're showing here is a list of all of the files in this repository. And what you may notice is that none of our project files are actually here. Now, like I said, in lesson 4, I'm going to show you another way to do this, but for now, I just want to show you a quick way to get all your project files into this repository. So I have 2 folders open in my File Explorer. The first one is the repository that we just made called Ball Maze Game. And the second one is the project files that we made in week 1. It's really quite simple. All we're going to do is copy and then paste it into our repository. And now back in our GitHub desktop, you'll notice that all of those files are listed here as changes. So we have 283 changed files. And if we scroll down, we can see a list of everything that we created. Now, if there's things that you didn't want to be pushed to the remote, you could deselect them here. Also notice that all of these have a green plus sign, and this means that the file was added to the repository. If it's a yellow minus sign, that means the file was changed. And if it's red, that means the file was deleted. So it's going to give you a list of everything that we just did. Now, I want to make sure that these files are on the remote repository so other people can begin to collaborate on this project with me, which means we need to do a commit of these changes and then push them to the remote. So down here at the bottom, we want to create a commit, and every commit requires a summary. So I'm just going to say that we added the project files. And then you can put some additional description here. I do recommend, if you're working on a team, to be as detailed as possible while also being concise. You don't want to write a novel, but there should be a list of everything that you did so that if someone else is going through, they understand what was changed as part of this commit. I think added project files is a good enough description for this, though. Everyone should understand what that means. So when I'm done, I can just say commit to main down here at the bottom. And then when that's done, this will give us a prompt that we want to push those commits to the remote. So I have a commit that now exists on my local repository, but no one else can see it yet until I do a push. So I'll just say push origin. And if you're pushing a lot of files, this may take some time. And especially when we're working in game projects, we're going to be pushing large files. And we'll discuss some tactics for this in lesson 4 on how to streamline this process a little bit and make sure that when we push, we don't get any issues. And now here on github.com, I can see that all of those files are now on the remote repository. So this means anyone else that's in this project with me will now have access to the files and they can make changes. So now we're ready to start working on the project with others. And I'll walk you through some of these steps in the next lesson.